All right, guys, if you've made it this far, you obviously have because you're listening to me. So if you're looking at the top of the screen, here's just that trick for showing you how you can split screen so that you can take the notes you're supposed to be typing in for your grade and put them on the right side, and then have this video you're watching now playing on the left side. If you want to know how to do that, watch this video first. Pause so you can go back and watch it. All right. So step one says to open the document notes sheet at the bottom of this page. So if you scroll down, here's that page. Click this link and pull open your notes document. I will pause me while you do it. All right. So I'm assuming that you've unpaused and you've got your notes page up and you got your video playing over here. And so let's get started with your notes. Right. So present mode on. Up until this point, we have been talking about the American Civil War, and we've tried to cover as much of it as we can, and now it's time to talk about the end of it, and how it wrapped up, and all that sort of stuff. So when we last left off, we talked about several of the major battles. Well, by April of 1865, the Confederacy is done. They're running out of money, they're running out of food, and they're running out of weapons. If you take a look at this picture right here, this is the one I had you look at the other day. You've got this young man. If you notice, he looks extremely young. By 1865, so many Confederate soldiers had died that they began filling their ranks with young men and boys. Look at his clothing. You see that first he's missing shoes. He's missing boots. Many of the Southern soldiers didn't have footwear. Also, his clothing, while also looking ragged, is way too big for him. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't have clothes that fit him. Odds are that these clothes did fit him when he first joined the Confederacy, but they've been eating so poorly. By the end of the war, they were eating the same thing they were feeding their horses, that he's lost so much weight, yet he continued to fight on until this, his very last day at the Battle of Petersburg. Atlanta, Columbia, Richmond are all in ruins. This is a picture of Atlanta following Sherman's march, and all you can see is the burned out wreckage and ruins of the buildings that was left behind. Richmond is in a similar state as is Columbia. The other few cities that they have in the South, such as New Orleans and Charleston, are under a Yankee Union occupation. Southern bridges, as you can see, this one from the New River, have already been destroyed. This one was destroyed during the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain. This is a newer bridge that was built to replace it. Railroads are destroyed, in many cases creating Sherman bow ties, where they rip up the tracks, heat them over a fire, and warp them around trees so that they can't be placed back down. The destruction of the railroads was twofold. It was a military target because Southerners could use the railroads to resupply their armies with weapons and men and food and whatnot. But it was also a total war strategy to take a blow to the people, because if you couldn't move grain, you couldn't move food, then the people would starve just as well as the soldiers did. To make matters even worse, you also have several farms and factories being destroyed. This is a picture from Sherman's march to the sea through Atlanta. And while it is a brutal picture, it doesn't make it less true. In this picture, it's hard for you guys to see, but here's a Yankee soldier slaughtering a pig. Here they are shooting a pig. Not always did they keep the pigs to eat. Sometimes they would just simply kill what they saw. There are also the side effects of most of the battles taking place in the South. And a lot of these battlefields were farmland, and now they are strewn with dead bodies, dead bullets, dead carriages. We have amateur archaeologists who go through Little Creek with metal detectors still to this day, pulling out bullets and such. So that was a definite downside. It gets to the point where on April 9th, Robert E. Lee asked Ulysses S. Grant, the General of the Union, to meet him at Appomattox Courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. And when he arrives, they begin to negotiate terms of surrender. Well, the U.S. and U.S. Grant was jokingly referred to as unconditional surrender. And that's what Grant demanded. You will surrender unconditionally. And that's exactly what happened. Now, when Lee surrendered, there were still some other Confederate soldiers fighting in different areas, but as soon as they heard that Lee had surrendered, slowly they began to surrender as well. And they take it upon themselves, the military men, to do this long before the Confederate government, which now has fled since the destruction of Richmond, to Danville and then on later to Mobile. So once the war is over, we have to face this concept of Reconstruction. If you work in construction, your job is to build things. So Reconstruction is rebuilding. Well, what needs to be rebuilt when this war is over? Well, there's some of the obvious things like Southern infrastructure. Let's rebuild the railroads. Let's fix the bridges. Let's fix the roads. There's homes, there's barns, there's factories, there's cities that need to be reburned. While Atlanta lay in ruins then, now it does not. They rebuilt it. But there's also other things that need to be rebuilt. For one, the relationship between the North and the South. The Southern states seceded. They formed their own country. Now we've got to figure out, how do we let them back in? Do we let them back in like nothing ever happened? Or are there conditions? How do we make sure that what happened before does not happen again? These are the things that has to be decided during Reconstruction. So Lincoln, his plan to put the country back together again was to not treat them unkindly. In his second inaugural address, he mentions that we should treat them with malice towards none and charity for all, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for he who has borne the battle and for his widow and for his orphan, to do all that may cherish a just and lasting peace. He wants to bring them back in and not punish them. This war has been punishment enough. And he also knows if you punish someone that you're trying to make part of your country again, then it's not going to lead to a spirit of true reunion. So he calls his plan the 10% plan. And the reason that is because he said all we really need is 10% of a state's voters. Now remember, when he's issuing this, a state's voters was basically white men above the age of 21. 10% of those must pledge loyalty to the United States and support the emancipation of slaves. Another group who was in control of Congress at the time earned the nickname the Radical Republicans, and they thought Lincoln was being way too easy on the South. Some of these Radical Republicans were ardent abolitionists. If you remember, back when we were starting all this, I showed you a cartoon that depicted a real event in the Senate chamber where a congressman from the South beat down a senator from the North, Senator Charles Sumner. They beat him so bad that it took him 3 years to recover. Well, Charles Sumner is one of these Radical Republicans. Do you feel someone like Sumner is going to want to take it easy on the South? And the answer is no. In fact, they want to punish the South. They see the South as the cause of this war. They were the ones who wanted the evils of slavery. They are the ones who seceded. They are the ones that bombed Fort Sumter. This is their fault. The 620,000 dead Americans, that's on them, and they should have to pay the price for it. One of the things that they do is demand civil rights for freedmen. Now that sounds great, and it was. If they had not done this, then 100 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. wouldn't have a legal precedent to stand on. But they did it so swiftly that it came as a complete culture shock to the Southerners who were coming back in. So what happens when you demand these rights for freedmen? How do you ensure that they get them? So they wanted to use Union soldiers to provide protection for these newly freed slaves in the South. Because just because the war is over and the South lost doesn't mean that every Southern person who grew up with this idea of what Black people were supposed to be and what white people were supposed to be were going to just automatically go along with what the Union said. You might need soldiers there to act as a police force to enforce this newly found freedom that they're giving to people of color. One thing that was proposed by the Radical Republicans was called the Wade-Davis Bill. Now, the Wade-Davis Bill came right at the end of the war. And instead of Lincoln's 10% of the Southerners must, take an oath of allegiance. This says that 50%, half of all eligible voters in the South, must swear allegiance to the North, to the Union, to the United States. And this passed in Congress, no problem. But of course it's going to pass in Congress, no problem. There are no Southern states or Southern representatives back in Congress yet. But Lincoln vetoes this. He says that's way too high of a number. But in April of 1865, whatever Lincoln wanted kind of fizzles, and it dies with him when Lincoln is assassinated by actor John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Booth did not have any official ties to the Confederacy. He had not been a Confederate soldier. He had been an actor. But he was very sympathetic to the South and considered himself a Southerner. And he viewed that by killing the tyrannical, in his view, tyrannical Lincoln, the South might have a chance to rise again. But usually people who go to such lengths stop thinking with logic and reason. When Lincoln dies, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes president. Now, I want you to imagine this. Lincoln has just been reelected. Just been reelected. He is assassinated within a month of taking his second oath of office. Lincoln knew he had death threats against him, but he never really thought that any of these assassination plots would take place. And so when he chooses Andrew Johnson to be his running mate, Johnson was not his choice for vice president his first 4 years in office. He makes Johnson his vice president during his second term as a symbolic choice. Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee. He had been a senator from Tennessee. And while the state of Tennessee had seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy, Johnson did not. He stayed loyal to the North. Now, not because he thought slavery was wrong. He himself was a slave owner. It was because, like his mentor, or the person he admired, Andrew Jackson, he felt that secession was wrong and that this country must stay together. So for that reason, he remained loyal to the North. Well, Lincoln chooses Johnson to be his vice president because he knows the war will be over soon, and it will look better to the South, and kind of a reconciliation symbol, a token symbol, if his vice president is a Southerner. But the worst did happen, and Lincoln was assassinated. And so now, after 4 years of fighting against Southern slave-holding states, our very first president, when this war is over, is a Southern slave owner. And this completely appalled the radical Republicans. Johnson waits until the Republicans are on leave for Christmas or over the holidays, and he then issues his own plan for Reconstruction. He's calling for state conventions to repeal the secession, have all these Southern states re-meet and repeal their secession. He eventually allows all the Southern states to rejoin the Union very quickly with very little stipulation, except for demanding that these individuals report straight to him and swear their oath of loyalty. Now, part of this was a snub in their face as well, because making them bow down to him. His actions completely tick off the radical Republicans. Every time they would pass a law trying to make things stricter, Johnson would veto it, and then they would have to override the veto. And this repeated over and over and over again. So much to the point that they set a trap for Johnson. They pass a law saying that he cannot fire people who had been hired by Lincoln. Now, this really has no value other than the fact that it is setting a trap. They know he's going to do it, and they want to set this trap so that when he does violate this law they made up, then they can impeach him. And that's exactly what they did. He is the first American president to be impeached. We've only had 2 others since then who have been impeached. Now, just because a lot of times we think impeached means kicked out. And it doesn't. It means it's the first step on trying to kick out a sitting president. So the impeachment are the charges that are brought against the sitting president. After the charges are brought, then the president is brought before the Supreme Court, and they make a ruling. They have a hearing and decide whether or not they should be kicked out. Well, Johnson stayed in office by 1 vote. But after that, he sort of mellowed down. So, what was life like during Reconstruction? If you take a look at this picture, you get kind of a clue. You have the angry Southern white mob on the left, still armed to the teeth, and on the right, you have the newly fired up, independent, free Southern African Americans who themselves are ready to take their freedom at whatever they can do. And then in the middle, you have a Union soldier trying to keep the peace. And that's a pretty good representation of what happens during Reconstruction. Carpetbaggers and scalawags. Now, these are derogatory terms. Now, what I mean by that, these are slams. These are shade that's being thrown. These are not words that you would have wanted to be used to describe yourself. A carpetbagger was the term that Southerners gave to Northerners, to Yankees, who, when the war was over, moved south with the sole purpose of making money at the expense of the Southerners. So think of this. Let's say that you fought for the Confederacy. You had a farm, maybe a rather large farm in Draper, Virginia. When you returned home from the war, you weren't home to work your farm. Maybe your wife and your children were, maybe you had some slaves. The slaves are now gone. Your wife or some of your children may have died due to starvation. There was no money left to buy more seed, to buy more plows, to buy the things that you needed. And then here comes the marching in armies, and it may have been a Confederate army and it may have been a Union army, but they were hungry. And so to feed themselves, they slaughtered your livestock. So now you've returned home and you don't have any cows or goats or chickens or pigs or anything like that. All you have is land that hasn't been worked in 4 years, and it needs a lot of work. And now you don't have people to help you work. You have no money. What money you had was in Confederate dollars, and now those are worthless. The only thing you have of value is the land itself. And here comes a Northerner who has moved down there, and he is offering you money for your land. Doesn't sound too bad, except your land may be worth $100,000, and he is offering you $5,000. They are exploiting the hard times and hard position that the Southerners are in to make their own profit, to make their own money. The term scalawag is also a term that is not a good term for someone to use to apply to you. So scalawag was a term given to Southerners, kind of like Andrew Johnson, who supported the Union during the war. Our very own state of Virginia had a lot of people that were treated very poorly because they chose to support the North. They didn't believe in secession. So imagine, think about our very own state. West Virginia was created by the Virginia Western counties that chose to stay loyal to the Union. Just because we're 2 counties away from West Virginia and we decided to stay with the Union doesn't mean that every single person in Pulaski County thought that fighting for the Confederacy was a good idea. In fact, a lot of them decided it wasn't and took action in that pursuit. One of the things that you get invented during this time period is the Freedmen's Bureau. So now we have all of these people who were enslaved for their entire life. Now they're not. Well, what do? Just because they're free doesn't mean that life is suddenly going to become better. It will, but not without struggle. There are basic things that survival that one needs that they don't have to fall back on. All of you guys are at the age of 16, 17 years old, where within the next couple of years, you're going to enter the quote unquote real world. Some of you are going to go to college. Some of you are going to go into the workforce, and many of you are going to go out seeking your own place to live, your own apartment, dorm room, or whatever. Well, in today's society, think about it. You move out, who usually helps you set up your first home? Who helps you, with your first set of dishes and sheets and furniture and ironing board and whatever you need? Well, it's usually your parents or your grandparents. You get support from the people around you. In my very own house, my first, living room couch was my grandmother's, as was the table that I had in there. The table and many of the things I had in my kitchen were hand-me-downs from friends and neighbors. Well, if you are a slave who have just gained your freedom, you can't get help like that from your parents. Your parents are in the same boat. So, how do we help these people who now are free but have no money, no education? Because remember, it was illegal in almost every southern state to even teach a person of color to read and write, and no skills other than those of working in a home or working in a field. How do we get them prepared to succeed? Well, that was the job of the Freedmen's Bureau. So they helped former slaves with schooling. They created schools, and the number of African Americans who sent their kids to these schools or themselves to these schools were astronomical, because the thirst for knowledge was recognized by these free slaves, because knowledge is power. Anyone who has ever struggled learning to read or write and knows that feeling of frustration can relate. You end up with your first elections following the Civil War during Reconstruction. African Americans now are voting, and they vote into office the first African American senator, Hiram Revels. You end up getting several amendments being passed, and the SOL really wants you to focus on these. Now think, an amendment is an addition or change to the Constitution. So the first one is the 13th. 13 being very unlucky for the South because it officially outlaws slavery. Slavery is abolished across the United States. Now, some of you in the audience may go, wait a minute, why did we have to have an amendment to free the slaves? Isn't that what the Emancipation Proclamation did? Yeah, sort of. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the Confederate states, the states that were rebelling. And even then, most of those southern states didn't even actually free their slaves because they did not recognize that the Abraham Lincoln was their president. So he may have issued this proclamation, but they felt no need to abide by it. The Emancipation Proclamation was very careful not to free slaves in the border states, in Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. The 13th clears that up. The 13th is passed before Lincoln is assassinated. And now slaves in every state, including those border states, are free. There's actually a celebration in the South called Juneteenth. And Juneteenth is a celebration of June 13th when this was made and enforced. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship to all persons born in the United States. Now that's a fancy word, but what that really means is everyone, no matter what color or race you are, must be treated equally. I cannot deny someone their equal rights based on their color. The 14th Amendment was actually reactionary. And what that means is they had not initially intended to pass that amendment. It was in reaction to Southern hate crimes against newly freed slaves. In the South, they were trying to pass laws that said that if you were Black, you could only have a job working in the field or in a person's house. They were trying to find legal ways to not have slaves, but to still have slaves. And so the radical Republicans were like, hey, we're going to fix that. 14th Amendment. You cannot treat someone not equally. And then the last one that they passed was the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing all freed men the right to vote. This also was reactionary. They assumed, hey, we freed them, you're now a citizen, everybody should know that means that they can vote. People of color can vote. Well, in the South, they once again tried to find ways to prevent newly freed slaves from voting. Things like a grandfather clause. If your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't vote, which of course every new freed slave's grandfather was born in the time of slavery and did not have the right to vote. They came up with things with poll taxes. If you want to vote, you got to pay a tax, which most newly freed African Americans didn't have any money. Or you got to take this test, proving that you can take it. So 15th Amendment said, hey, I don't care who you are, you can vote. accepting these newly freed African Americans as equals was easier said than done. In fact, you end up with the formation of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, has had several reincarnations. The first was created following the Civil War. Now, it initially began as simply a group of former Confederates, almost like a VFW, where they were joining together to just sort of fellowship. But then it began to rot into something even worse. And what happens is a lot of these former Confederate troops begin donning masks because they were doing things they knew were illegal. And plus, if you do something you are truly ashamed of, you don't want the world to know it. And they begin terrorizing Black people across the South. Lynchings, burnings, harassment, you name it. You end up with a system called sharecropping. This was how the South successfully got around the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Well, how do we get workers for our plantations? So in the South, they still don't have a lot of mechanization. All they have is the land, and that's what they have to make their money off of. Well, they cannot, even if they wanted to, these newly freed Confederates, or even if they didn't fight in the Confederacy, these Southerners couldn't afford to actually pay African Americans or Caucasian. They couldn't afford to pay anyone to work on their farm. Most of the returning Confederates came back to, like I said before, they were land rich and cash poor. They didn't have any money. They had very little. They did have land, but that was about it. So how do we get workers to work our land without having to pay them? And sharecropping was the answer. So you get many slaves, and honestly, it wasn't just slaves. You had a lot of poor white people taking up this offer as well. What they do in sharecropping is, let's see if this works. Let's say that you have this pie chart, which is an ugly pie chart, I understand. So let's say you have this pie chart that represents all the crops that you grow. Well, if you were a newly freed slave, say, hey, you were my slave during the Civil War. You don't know what else to do other than pick cotton? That's great. I'll rent you the bottom 40 acres. All you have to do is pay me half for your rent. I'll take half of whatever you grow. Well, it's okay. So they still get to keep half their crop. Well, they get ready to start growing the crop, and they're like, wait a minute, I don't have seed. I don't have baskets. I don't have, crops. I don't have a horse. I don't have tools. Where am I going to get all this stuff? Well, go buy it. Well, they're the newly freed slaves or the new sharecroppers are like, I can't afford to buy it. I don't have any money. Oh, okay. Well, then, how about I take another quarter and I loan you what you need, and you can pay me back another fourth of what you grow to repay those loans. That leaves only a fourth of everything they grow to keep. Well, what if the weather's bad? What if there's locusts? What if? That comes out of your quarter, not the rest of it. And by doing this, these sharecroppers can never earn enough money through their crop to ever get out of debt, to ever get out of owing the plantation owner. This is economic slavery, and it keeps a huge portion of people in the South poor all the way up through the 20th century. If you're familiar with Johnny Cash grew up as a sharecropper's son. It was one of the things that caused him to want to leave home. All right, so, this did not erase. Okay, so let's look at these black codes. So black codes were passed in the South to limit the rights of African Americans. So these are things, like I said before, that were things like, if you're black, then you could only get a job as a field hand, or maybe a domestic, aka a maid. They were essentially trying to keep the people of color subservient. And what that means is keep them less than, trying to find legal ways to still keep them down. All right, so what happened to the former generals? Well, let's start off with Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee urged Southerners to reconcile. He is telling them, let the war be over with. In fact, when he died, he left instructions that if anybody tried to show up to his funeral wearing their Confederate uniform, they were to be denied admittance. He said, that war is over. We are part of the United States again. Let it go. He also ends up getting a job as a dean, or the president of Washington College. Now it bears his name, Washington and Lee. He couldn't go back to farming. His own plantation was located in Alexandria, Virginia. Many of you have been there. It was converted during the war as sort of a pre-punishment and turned into a graveyard. If you've ever been to Arlington National Cemetery, you are walking on Robert E. Lee's plantation. It's hard to go back to planting cotton or wheat or grain when dead bodies are planted all over your farm. But that's where he ends up serving as the president of Washington College. Ulysses S. Grant. What happens to Grant when the war is over? Well, he's elected president in 1868. He's one of the most popular men in the country when the war is over, and he rides that popularity all the way to the White House. And that's from that position that he really works to continue getting freedoms and rights for African Americans. He successfully squashes the first KKK. It's only comes back years and years and years after his presidency. So how does Reconstruction end? When is it over? How is it over? Well, this is kind of a big deal. You get another questionable election. So in 1876, you've got a couple people running for office, one of which is Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. In fact, he ends up getting the nickname Rutherford B. Hayes. He's up against a Democratic candidate named Samuel Tilden. Now, by this point, you would think the success of the war and Republicans like Lincoln would mean that the Republicans would have an easy way to keep office, but it's actually not true. Once Lincoln is over, there is a huge group of Democrats, not just Southerners, who have become unhappy with what the Republicans are doing, including continued presence in the South. It's becoming very expensive. So the results of this election are pretty mixed. If you notice, looking across the country, you've got a pretty even split between Republican and Democrat. Hayes has 4 million votes, 36,572, while Tilden had 4,200,000, 84 and 20. Now that's pretty close, but it looks like Tilden should definitely have won. But if you remember from what we learned with Jackson, that you can't just win a little, you have to win by a lot. And if you don't win by a lot, it ends up going to the House of Representatives. Tilden had won 184 of the Electoral College votes, Hayes only winning 165. But because you end up having several votes in dispute, think about the own election that we're in right now where people are arguing over these votes. So there are 20. That's a big deal because if you take 20 and add it to 165, you get 185, which means Hayes would win. But he would have to get every single electoral vote from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Each party reported its candidate had won those states. So the Republicans are saying, Hayes has won all of them. But the Democrats are saying, no, Tilden has won all of them. Well, who did? There is some sort of screwy deal that goes on to polish this off. Since Reconstruction, Union troops have occupied the South. They have been there to enforce all of those laws. If they see you treating a black person wrong, they step in. If they see that you haven't freed your slaves, they show up and make sure your slaves are freed. So they also are the ones controlling the election boards. So they fix this election so that Hayes wins. They even make deals with many of the Southerners to, if you let us fix this election, we'll give you things in return. Hence this compromise. So first, the Democrats agree not to argue this fixed election. We're not going to argue with you. You go ahead and let this one man be president for this one term. What we'll do in return, says Republicans and Hayes's supporters, we'll pull all the troops, every Yankee soldier out of the South. Now, I want you to imagine if you were a newly freed person of color. living in the South. The only thing that has been keeping you safe is the presence of those Yankee soldiers. What do you worry about will happen to you if those Yankee troops are pulled out? Exactly what you're afraid of does happen. This marks the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow era. The KKK resumes its power and takes control of the southern states. They begin segregating blacks and whites in many different ways. States find ways to continue to deny black people their rights, and nobody is able to do anything to stop it. So you get things like you see here, where you get separate water fountains, you get separate laundry facilities, you get several drink facilities. Notice here, Coca-Cola machine, but only if you're white. I mean, there was a tremendous effort to keep blacks and whites separate, to deny this sense of unity. All right, there's your notes. Once you have your notes typed in and completed, go back to your Canvas page. Scroll up. You should have a submit button here. Click it and turn it in. All right. See you guys in class.